Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you to our speakers and all the attendees joining from different platforms for being here with us. This is a very special event for the India Migration Now team. It's on a very core tenet of how we work, which is the integration of migrants. And this masterclass, as we're calling it, will explore some core questions, very, very core questions about what is integration, how do we apply it in both the internal and international context? What does it mean to create integration policies and interventions around integrating migrants, and also critiquing it, critiquing the Eurocentricity of it, critiquing the destination perspective. And so we have speakers who will come from both the European perspective and also from an Indian perspective and reflect on the core concepts of migrant integration. My name is Varun Agarwal. I'm the founder and lead of India Migration Now. And I just want to take a minute of your time to talk about India Migration Now. So, India Migration Now is a nonprofit organization, an initiative with the Southeast Migration Foundation. We have three core work streams. One is our research and advocacy work, the results of which you are witnessing. Here we do a lot of work on not just migration within India, but also from India and into India. We take a very comprehensive view of the issue. And for us, migration is an opportunity for India, and we want to maximize those opportunities. The second, which is one of our primary interventions, is something called the Cello Network. It is a financial inclusion program for low-income migrant communities all over India. We focus on an end-to-end agent network which provides social welfare and financial services for migrant households in all the key corridors of the country. You can learn more about, by the way, these things on our website, indiamigrationnow.org. And finally, which is a much more nascent but very, very high potential program we're developing around the skilling and overseas deployment of immigrant workers, especially in new emerging destinations. We'll be talking about, as a part of our research advocacy work, we'll be talking about MyPEX India, which is an initiative with the Migration Policy Group, for which Giacomo will later talk about, and IMPEX, which is the adaptation that we have created of MyPEX for the internal migrant context within India. So we'll expand on both these indices, which have been developed in collaboration and also solo by India Migration Now. Now, to begin the proceedings today, we have Dr. Peter Scholten from Erasmus University at Rotterdam. I'm very excited to have him here and give us a lowdown on what is migrant integration and what role does it play internationally. So without further ado, over to you, Peter. I'll stop my share.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Varun. And I'm honored to be here and to speak to this masterclass, and also to speak to the topic of what is migrant integration actually, and what role does it play internationally. And I'll try also to make the connection to the role that indices like IMPEX, MyPEX can play in working with migrant integration. So let me move ahead immediately. Migrant integration is a very widely used concept in the field of migration studies, but also beyond. It has become a concept used a lot in public discourse, in policy discourse. And this has not always served the clarity of the concept. One of the key issues there is how to define migrant integration and what migrant integration actually is. For instance, one of the key questions here is whether migrant integration is actually a social process, which refers to something taking place in the reality of migrants, something that can be referred to as incorporation in a broader sociological sense, which can be a very multifaceted phenomenon, addressing social issues, economic issues like participation, finding a job, finding a proper house, but also political issues. So becoming a full member, becoming a full citizen. And this social process can also be an individual or a communitarian process, which also comes down to very different conceptualizations. It's often seen as a long-term process, which I think we'll come back to that later, can be a tension with often an urge to find short-term quick fixes for migrant integration. And one of the core issues for migrant integration as a social process is who's actually integrating into what. And that is not always so clear and so obvious. And different settings, it can mean entirely different things. And for different targets, it can mean different things. For instance, speaking to the Indian situation, on which I'm not an expert, but I'm trying to learn a lot from my dear Indian colleagues. Sometimes integration can mean very different things when it comes to domestic interstate migration within India, or when it comes to urban-rural migration, or when it comes to international migration. There can be important differences. Another definition, another meaning of migrant integration is migrant integration as a real policy model, which is more normative, which sets standards, which sets a clear target, which is often referred to as integrationism. And in this sense, integration is a clear strategy that has to be implemented in a very coordinated way, targeted at migrants who arrive, who come into certain areas and need to be turned into full citizens or to participating citizens in a certain area. And so policy model is a more normative meaning of migrant integration, where a social process is a broader sociological interpretation of migrant integration. But that's not the only discussion in the literature on migrant integration. Another one is between migrant integration and its traditional conception and the more contemporary complexity view on migrant integration. So in this traditional view, migrant integration is seen as a rather linear process. So a migrant leaves one place, goes on a migration journey, arrives and settles in another place, and then starts this integration process, which is a linear but also transformative process. And so integration is a process of leaving one place and becoming part of your host or your settlement area. And it can only have one endpoint, and that is full citizenship, full membership of the area in which you settle. And in this traditional view, integration is often also perceived as something that should be actively encouraged and organized and coordinated by a government. So governments organize integration processes. So this contrasts with a more contemporary perspective on integration, which embraces complexity of it. This complexity comes in different ways. One of them is complexity in terms of mobility patterns. And so the traditional of a migrant leaving one place and then just settling permanently in another, that does less and less justice to the actual social reality that we are observing in international and domestic migration patterns. So the term liquid mobility refers to that. So migrants are sometimes people who are passing through or settling only temporarily, and often migrants don't know whether they are settling permanently or temporarily. There's a lot of uncertainty. Another point is super diversity, that migrants, it's increasingly difficult to clearly define who the migrants are who are supposed to be integrating, and also in what they are supposed to be integrating. So this is a perspective of social complexity, which is described by people like Steven Vertevek as super diversity. So this complicates the picture of integration further. In this more contemporary view, integration becomes a more intransformative concept. So it's not that you transform from one thing into another. Now, integration adds something to your social participation, to your economic mobilization, to your political participation. And it can have multiple outcomes. One of them is full citizenship. It can be naturalization, full citizenship. One of them can also be that you're just the American perspective, a tax-paying citizen. But it doesn't mean that you need to naturalize or culturally transform as well. And in this conception, integration is a networked approach. So governments can be a player in that, but they're often not the only player. There are multiple players who can be important in defining and implementing a migrant integration approach. So the government here depends on many other actors like NGOs, like migrants as individuals themselves. They're also agents. Migrants are not only targets, they're themselves also agents in integration processes. So an important message is that if we have gone from this linear view of migrant integration to a more contemporary complexity perspective, so what does that mean in how we study migrant integration, and for today's discussion, how you would measure migrant integration, how you would develop indices? I think a very important part of that is to capture the complexity of integration rather than to reduce it in a very singular, often symbolic model of integration. Just try to map the complexity and bring together the many different aspects, the many different facets of migrant integration. I think this is one of the best things that indices like MIPACs and impacts are doing. They are not reducing integration to a singular mono-dimensional thing. They are trying to capture this multidimensionality. And there are many dimensions. And if I just approach it from a more literature point of view, there are 4 core questions that you can ask for migrant integration. So who's targeted, who's involved? This brings the question of demarcation of target groups. Labor migration, integration patterns of labor migrants can differ significantly of integration patterns of family migrants, or love migrants differ from asylum, refugee, a humanitarian type of migration. So it's very important who is involved. Another one is whether integration is a two-way process. In Europe, we are also increasingly studying the integration of what we used to call the native population. So to what extent is the native population also adjusting and accommodating and adapting to this new reality of living in super diverse cities. Cities like London, but even my own smaller city of Rotterdam, more than 50% of the population has a migration background. So who is integrating into what, and who is minority and majority? It's not so clear anymore. And very important is the demarcation of time factor. Sociologists don't agree on many things, but they do agree on that integration takes a very long time. It takes years, if not decades, and I think that most sociology would say it takes generations before integration processes are really full, in a sense. So the demarcation of the time factor is important. So if you want to influence integration processes as a government, as an NGO, but also as an individual, you need to be realistic on how much time you need to take for those processes. Another question is what? So what does integration actually involve? What do you want to achieve with integration? And then there are many different terms that you can apply in this sense, and many different operationalizations of migrant integration in different settings. And this is also one of the shadow sides of the concept of migrant integration. The concept is used very widely in many different settings, many different contexts, but often on the ground it can mean very different things. But if people talk to each other with the concept of integration, it can give the false illusion that they are talking about the same thing, whereas in reality, in some cities, regions, countries, integration means participation, economic participation, standing on your own 2 feet. And then in another setting, it can mean emancipation, becoming a full equal part, equal opportunities, not being discriminated against. In another part is mobilization, so raising your voice, exit voice or loyalty. So when you are a full citizen when you raise your voice and when you are part of the political process and also contribute to the society in which you are living. You're not only working there and sending to where you come from, no, you are an active citizen in that area, mobilization. In other settings, it can mean assimilation. Academically speaking, assimilation is just like integration, also an essentially contested concept. But sociologists say that assimilation is an iron law. It always takes place. It sometimes takes 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, but there are hardly any cases where assimilation did not happen at some point. So in some settings, assimilation, also in a cultural sense, may be an objective. Then another aspect is, how do you do it? So how do you achieve integration? In some setting, integration, and this is also, Varun was referring to his Eurocentric bias. I think one of the Eurocentric biases that has been exported from Europe to the concept of integration is that integration should be something that states do. States do integration. States integrate people, and integration is needed for the preservation of the state. I see that in many situations, many contexts, that integration comes with a very state-centric view on how to achieve it. In some other settings, it comes with more stronger role of civil society, so that civil society drives migrant integration processes. And in yet other settings, integration is left to individual responsibility. So states set targets, but migrants are the ones who should integrate themselves. They are responsible. They are individual citizens who should take care and sometimes even finance their own integration trajectory. So these are very different policy options chosen in many different settings, but they all refer to migrant integration. So an index can help you to then find out, well, what choices have been made in these settings. Another one is why integrate? So it can have very different rationales. It can have economic rationales, it can have cultural rationales, it can have social rationale behind it. Integration often also problematizes a situation. And if you follow the integration discourses, then you often find whether this is a problematization of economics, so migrants should participate, or cultural sense, cultural problematization, or social sense. Migrants are alienated, they are too much on their own, they are being discriminated against, for instance. And these all go into the container box of the concept of integration. There are a number of risks and pitfalls in using the concept of migrant integration. And actually, speaking more from the migration studies point of view, integration has become quite an essentially contested concept. Many governments, many research groups are also abandoning the concept and trying to go to other concepts like inclusion, more general concepts. I'll come back to that later. But let me just summarize the current critical debate in academia on the concept of migrant integration in 4 core points. One of them is the othering. So integration usually comes with an othering of migrants. It problematizes the situation of migrants in an economic, social, cultural, identificational sense. There are many different ways. But this can lead, following traditional, classical sociological labeling theory, to the adverse of integration by problematizing migrants, stressing their need for integration. The impact can be that you label migrants as a problem and that you contribute to their othering rather than their approximation of society. So you achieve the contrary of integration, actually. Often, I have to add, inadvertently. And so this is an inadvertent discursive side effect of governments. Even if governments really have very good intentions with their policies, emphasizing integration, emphasizing the need for migrants to integrate can contribute to quite the adverse, according to labeling theory. Another one is a too strong belief in the governability of migrant integration. So contributing to the idea that there are quick fixes, that you can solve integration rapidly and that you should do that with a tough approach. Or in some situations, I mean, the tough approaches we all know, but sometimes also with a lot of money. It's often not just the money that you power into migrant integration that counts, that then would actually lead to a more swift integration process. Integration doesn't let itself be governed quite well. It goes quite slow, and the influence on social emancipation, cultural emancipation, it has a long breath. And it's also about changing the attitudes of people. And that's difficult for states to really influence in a straightforward way. Another one, and this is the one where I have published most on, is treating integration too much as a standalone topic. So setting it apart as another vertical policy pillar. And this doesn't do justice to the reality where integration is often a part of your housing policy, it's a part of your social policy, it's a part of your education policy, of your labor market policy. It's a part of pretty much everything that you do in your society. And in this sense, it's closer to topics like climate mainstreaming, gender mainstreaming. It really looks a lot like those topics. But strangely enough, I often see policy responses that do pillarize or treat migrant integration as standalone, whereas for gender and for climate, the awareness that this is a horizontal, cross-sectoral topic has been accepted much more. I think this is one of the key developments we'll see in the coming
out of time. Just quickly want to wrap it up. Yeah.
Yes, I'll come to my last minute, Varun. So the last one is Eurocentrism, but Varun has already addressed that. So this Eurocentric view of migrants, problematizing them and believing strong belief in the role of the state is also something that is attached to the concept. My very last words, Varun, is about the international application. So the first part is that there has actually been quite little international application of the concept of integration, quite little comparative research. There's a strong lack of that. I think it's a good thing of MIPAC's impacts, that it allows us to do more comparative research and also to study our so-called national models of integration from a more comparative and critical point of view. But there is a great prospect in these indexing efforts, so that they help us do comparative research and that also embraces and tries to map and recognize and acknowledge complexity rather than reducing it into symbolic national models. It allows us also to provide, to develop more targeted comparisons of specific aspects of integration. So for instance, integration in the labor market in India, in Europe, in the United States, in Brazil, so much more faceted comparisons rather than these big comparisons of migrant integration in general, which don't work so well in general because of the complexity of the concept. So targeted comparisons work better, and these comparisons also need to be contextualized more. So integration, but also social economic integration, social cultural emancipation mean different things in different countries, in different states within India, but probably also for different targets in India. So this index always needs to be contextualized with your local setting in which you have collected the data. Last word here is that the term integration, I think we need to remain critical of that and be very precise in what we mean by it, and not give the illusion that integration is, to come back to what I said in the beginning, that it's a very clear and straightforward policy model. Let's use integration more as a concept that we apply to the study of incorporation processes, that we apply to the study of processes of inclusion. And in this way also contribute not to setting apart migrant integration as a separate policy pillar, but contributing to promoting the mainstreaming of inclusion into different sectors like education, housing, even agriculture. Migrant integration can also be a part of our agricultural policies and pretty much everything that we do as states. Thank you so much for your time, and sorry for going a little bit over time.
No worries, Peter. Thank you so much, and for setting the context for the rest of the seminar. And we're still collecting questions, so I think after Giacomo's presentation, we'll have questions for both you and Giacomo together, given I think they flow together well. So without further ado, Giacomo Solano from the Migration Policy Group, a good friend and close collaborator of IMN. Giacomo, if you want to start off and share your screen, we'll just proceed accordingly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Varun. I'm going to share the screen immediately. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting to this masterclass. As you said, I mean, the Migration Policy Group, and particularly me and you, we have cooperated since 2008 on IMPEX and then on MyPEX. So I'm really honored and thrilled to be here in this, I hope, this groundbreaking, let's say, masterclass to foster the integration debate in India and to go also beyond this European, let's say, way of defining and addressing integration. So now, compared to Peter, we are shifting a little bit the focus on integration policies, not only on integration, but also we look at integration policies, and now to comparatively analyze and address integration policies through the use of what I'm going to explain later, the use of indicators. And I will provide the example of MyPEX. So in general, what does integration policy stand for? So literature in general define integration policies as something that stipulate what, let's say, is expected from migrants. Also the condition, as also Peter said, required to migrants to become or even remain a part of the society, and also the entitlements and the rights that these migrants have in the destination society. But how we can analyze and compare these policies and more in general integration and migration policies. So there is a challenge, and researchers have encountered many challenges, let's say, in operationalize also the policies and to compare these policies across countries, which often have very different administrative and political framework. So to, let's say, solve or tackle these challenges, many researchers have started to create what we call indexes set of indicators to study migration and integration policies. Especially, for example, together also with Peter, we carried out a project that's called a European project called Cross Migration. And as part of this project, we also review all this effort to assess and analyze migration policies in a comparative fashion. And we found, for example, that these indexes, this project, have mushroomed over the last 15, 20 years. And we found almost 70 indexes analyzing migration and integration policies. So an indicator is just a question on a specific topic or subtopic. Like, for example, you can see here an example from MyPEX. So you have a question on one topic and you have different possible answer option reflecting different situation, and depending on the country situation, for example, on the Indian situation, on that topic, on that subtopic, a score is assigned. Indexes are just a summary, say a summary value or a combination of these indicators, and they result in a summary score, for example, in the case in the case of MyPEX at the country level, which is actually just an average of all the score of the indicators. So I'm now moving to MyPEX, which is one of the 70 indexes that we found, and it has been created by the Migration Policy Group in 2004. So MyPEX, as I said, addresses integration policies and compare these policies across at the national level, including in this last edition 52 countries. So MyPEX has, first of all, a longitudinal scope. So as I said, it has been created in 2004. Then the current version is from 2007. And we have now a longitudinal data set spanning more than 12 years. For new countries like India, we have only from 2014 to 2019, but still we have a longitudinal analysis, or we provide the possibility of doing longitudinal analysis. So we focus on integration, but we try to reflect this multi-dimensionality and multifaceted aspect of integration policies. So we focus on 8 different policy areas, such as, for example, labor market, education, permanent residence and access to nationality, health, political participation, and others. As a target group, we focus on international migrants, so migrants that are non-citizens. In the case of Europe, non-European migrants also. And we target, let's say, and we focus on different kinds of international migrants, and we distinguish between them to see also the differences in the legislation. So we focus on migrant workers, on family reunited migrants, and permanent residents, and also to a lesser extent on refugees. As I said, we have a kind of rather wide geographical scope. In the last edition, we included 52 countries. So when we started in 2004, 2007, we only focused on European countries, but then we tried to go beyond this Eurocentric approach and study of integration. So we start widening the scope. The second edition in 2010 included also countries like a traditional country of immigration, non-European traditional country of immigration, like, for example, the US, Canada, Australia. We also included some Asian countries, like, for example, Japan and Korea. And in this very last edition, we try to go beyond also a Western approach, or studying only Western countries. So, for example, now we have India. We are very glad to have India, of course. We have China, we have Indonesia, and we are also studying Latin America with Mexico, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. What we think that it's very unique of MIPEX is that we strongly rely on national experts, and we then run a set of checks at the central level, so at MPG, to allow to be sure, let's say, or to be sure that the data are of course correct and they are in line with the MIPEX methodology, and also to be sure that the same situation in one country receive the same score across different countries. So the idea is, let's say, to go through the national expert in details, but also to have data that are comparable enough to allow for comparison across countries, or reliable enough to allow for comparison between countries. MIPEX has also, since it has been created quite some time ago, has also been widely used by different actors, like policymakers, NGOs, international organizations, but also media, and also a lot by researchers who has tried to link MIPEX to integration of migrants, to see also the effect of integration policy on the integration of migrants. For example, just to give you an example, MIPEX was included in the first draft of the Global Compact on migration as a powerful tool to monitor integration policies in the countries. What I forgot to say is that MIPEX includes 58 indicators, so quite some indicators, and these are, as I said, sorted in different policy areas. I want just to touch the MIPEX approach, let's say, to integration. So we start from the definition that I illustrated at the beginning, but we also make use of, let's say, equality standards based on international references or EU level references as a benchmark, let's say, like, for example, International Convention from the United Nations, the ILO, or EU directives. Our theoretical starting point when it comes to integration is also that there should be, let's say, or we should follow two principles. The first one is the principle of equality of opportunities. So migrants should have the same, or as much as possible, the same, similar, let's say, opportunities as non-migrants. And the second one is that the principle of migrant vulnerability. So statistics and figures for example, labor market, education, and other aspects of integration shows that migrants encounter additional challenges compared to non-migrants. So this means that there should be also ad hoc and targeted support measure to support them to tackle this, or to overcome these challenges. I'm now moving to the findings of the last edition. So sorry if I repeat that. So as I said before, we sort. So the idea is to sort the indicators and MIPEX in general in 8 policy areas. However, in this last edition, we try to go beyond this division in 8 different policy areas to try to address and capture also countries' approach to integration and the different dimensions underpinning these country approaches. So based on some statistical analysis, we found 3 main dimensions underpinning a country approach to integration. The first one related on whether or not immigrants enjoy comparable rights as nationals, and we call it access to basic rights. So it refers, for example, to equal rights to work, to training, to access to health, and also to be subject, let's say, or be protected by non-discrimination policies. The second dimension refers to equal opportunities. So to whether or not migrants receive support to enjoy comparable opportunities as nations. Here we refer.
Giacomo, a 2-minute warning.
2 minutes, okay. So here we refer more to target support and not only on access. So for example, on education, support to access the health services, and also political participation, so opportunities to participate in the political area, let's say, arena of the country of destination. The last one we call secure future, and it refers to whether or not migrants are able and supported with their long-term settlement and to feel and to secure their future in the country. So here typically we refer to family unification, permanent residence, for example, and access to nationality. Based on this, we found, let's say, 5 main approaches to integration. The first 2 are quite similar because it entails a comprehensive approach to integration. That means the countries invest both on rights, opportunities, and security. So here migrants enjoy equal rights, equal opportunities, and a secure future. The difference between what we call the top 10 countries, let's say, and the other countries applying a comprehensive approach is that the second one goes only halfway, let's say, in providing migrants with equal rights, opportunity, and security. Then the third group of countries, the third approach to integration is different from the first 2 because countries in this under this approach, let's say, or applying this approach, do not invest enough, let's say, in all the 3 aspects, the 3 dimensions of integration. So here in these countries, or countries in this group that employ a temporary integration approach, enjoy equal rights and opportunities, but they don't have enough opportunities to secure the long-term settlement in the country. Then another approach we call equality on paper, because countries under this approach or applying this approach, they focus and they provide migrants with equal rights and opportunity for a secure future, but not enough opportunity to a full and similar, let's say, to non-migrants integration. The last group of country focus mainly on long-term settlement, but does not provide migrants with equal rights or equal opportunities. We call this immigration without integration. What we want just to show that there are, of course, also these 5 different approaches, different, let's say, degree of policy, different range of policies. So we further sort these 5 approaches in 10 groups. I'm not going into the groups. I want just to show some differences at the regional level, at the continent level. And you see that Asian countries, they mainly apply this immigration without integration approach, with the exception of Korea, for example. It's also interesting to see that there is not a common European approach, not even a Mediterranean common European approach. And you see that also the most traditional country of destination of immigration, like the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are in the top 10 category of countries applying a comprehensive approach. I just want to touch base on the policy effect. So in the frame of another project, we also looked at the link between policies and outcomes, so the concrete outcomes in terms of integration of migrants, like the share of migrants in employment, for example. We reviewed only peer-reviewed scientific studies linking MIPEX to integration outcomes, and we found that integration policies matter, and that the major disparity in integration policies reflect also the major differences in integration outcomes. We also found that, let's say, this relation between integration policies and integration outcomes kind of play or follow, let's say, what also Peter was saying, integration as a two-way process. Yeah. So we saw that, for example, better integration or more open integration policies are linked both to a higher degree of acceptance of migrants in the country, to the happiness of these migrants in the countries. So I'm going to skip the conclusion and just to thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Giacomo, for that. You really get a basis of the work MPG has done and also the implications of it from the results. And we wish we had more time to go in depth on the results, and definitely something for us to do going forward. So we already have some questions coming up in the Q&A. Giacomo, there's one for you. Do you mind, just in the interest of time, if you could answer it in the Q&A itself? There's one for you regarding some citation. I'm going to raise one question for Peter while he's still here with us. From Shilpi Nagalia. And she asks, in a context where the state is very hostile to the idea of integrating minorities within socioeconomic and political fabric of the country, to what extent, in your view, Peter, can the civil society play a meaningful role in the process of integrating minority communities? If you can just briefly, and you can also answer in more details in the Q&A, but just for a minute, if you can sort of address this.
Yeah, thank you, Varun, for this question, and thank you, Shilpi, for this question. Your question refers to quite widespread phenomenon where in Giacomo's typology, the countries which have immigration but no integration approach, then usually others step in. So it's not just whether states are hostile to the idea or are preventing it, but also just when there's an absence of an approach, then usually NGOs step in and fill the gap. And this is a widespread phenomenon. You could say informal integration processes also there. In some countries you see more reliance on community organizations, so the migrants do it themselves, which is very powerful, agent perspective of migrants. It can also lead to the reification of migrant identities, because you then mobilize along the lines of your own ethnic and cultural group. So this can be a side effect of states not working on integration. So yes, basically the response is that yes, in particular when there are no state coordinated integration policies, then NGOs step in and fill the gap. But I wouldn't want to say that it's only in the number 10 typology of Giacomo, so the states with immigration but no integration. You can also see it in North America. You can also see it in Europe, actually, where policies often leave gaps. Or policy are not responsive, not swift enough in responding to new migration flows. And also in those situations, businesses, sometimes companies have a need for integration because they want employees who are happy, who can speak the language, and who feel safe. And NGOs who step in the refugee situation in Europe in 2015 and 16. Most of the immediate effects of that were dealt with by NGOs, and states only came in later. You could say also that the states were perhaps even reluctant to step in there and to play a facilitating role. So it's quite a universal universal process there. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. And like I said, there's also the option to give more detailed citations if you want in the Q&A box if you have the time. I'm going to switch up the schedule here because I know Dr. Srivastav's he has to leave at some point. So I'm going to, Priyansha, if you don't mind, I'll have Dr. Srivastav present, which is a bit of obviously Priyansha was going to introduce the IMPEX index, and we'll have that after Dr. Srivastav now. So Ravi sir, if you don't mind, just share, if you, I don't know if you're sharing a presentation to share your screen, and he'll be talking about workplace integration, and this is in the context of internal migration within India, measures for the world of work, including labor market entry, labor protection, and social benefits. Yes,
Okay.
Ravi sir.
Varun, can you see me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay, because I can't see myself just now. Uh, thank you very much for inviting me to this and persuading me, therefore, to read the impacts and the literature around it, and also the MIPEX, and also for two excellent presentations by Peter and Giacomo. The first presenting a more general view of integration, both say social, the different dimensions of integration, and the second talking more specifically about the MIPEX. Uh, there is obviously, when we move from international migration to internal migration, there is a world of a difference. Unlike international migration, where states can keep migrants out. So, we are talking about, at the moment, talking about the problem of integration, but I cannot help but reflect on the conditions of migrants who at the moment are not being able to get an opportunity to migrate. And one hears the news daily of migrants dying on the high seas or attempting to get into countries on a very large scale, actually. Guatemala was the last where we saw large scale skirmishes happening. Uh, so unlike international migrants, of course, internal migrants do have the prospects of some kind of mobility within their states or between the states. And also unlike international migrants, where one can distinguish between citizens and non-citizens and a set of differentiated rights, and then argue about rights and citizenship. In effect, internal migrants do have constitutional rights, which are given to them, however graded and differentiated they are. Uh, there are therefore these very important differences between internal migrants and international migrants. Uh, and I think I'm extremely happy to see the IMPEX index come up for the reason that migration studies is not really an area which is very recent in India, but in some sense it is still in the infancy. And certainly when you look at the policy dimension, um, after the recent crisis, of course, we have had a spurge of studies on migration, attention on migration by both state and non-state actors. But in general, there has been very little focus on migration, very little attention on migration being played in India. And therefore, this very substantive study, and I think the one notable aspect of this substantive study is that it brings together a lot of information on what is happening at the state level, at this and the state level policies. And bringing that information together itself is, I think, an extremely positive thing to do. But however, let me just point out, and Varun talked about workplace integration and so on, is that there is, when you when you look at indices of this kind, there is of course the problem of averaging, and there is a problem of aggregation. Now, when internal migration is extremely heterogeneous in the kinds of people that migrate, the streams of migration, uh, temporality, circumstances, and so on and so forth. And it is extremely difficult to address all these extremely very meaningful in a single index. So, for example, in India, we do know that policy, that the well-off migrants in India, and I'm using it in lieu of any other shorthand notation, do not really have a deficit of rights. Even though policy does not seek them out, but in general they do quite well. In fact, data tells us that they do, on the average, they do better than non-migrants. The problem really in India is with respect to the migrants in the informal economy. But even when we look at migrants in the informal economy, one can at least distinguish between three broad groups of migrants, and there are substantial differences among each of them. One is the interstate migrants, and interstate migrants within the informal economy, uh, circular migrants, or even long-term migrants. Then the interstate migrants, which fall into two categories as the recent crisis showed us. One is the long-term migrants, who still are circular migrants. So they have their roots in the rural areas. And we saw in the crisis that they were uprooted from the urban areas and they made their way back to the rural areas. And then we have the seasonal and circular migrants who really at the bottom of the pile. But all the three, of course, suffer from different kinds of deficits and different kind of vulnerabilities. If you look at large states like Gujarat, for example, where you associate the highest deficits not only with migrants from neighboring states like Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, but also from tribal areas within Gujarat itself. And this is the case also with West Bengal. This is also the case partly with Karnataka. This is the case with Tamil Nadu, with what was formerly United Andhra Pradesh, with Uttar Pradesh, and so on and so forth. So in many of these, even internal within state migrants suffer large deficits in the kind of areas that IMPEX has tried to map. And if you look at the interstate migrants, which has been the focus of IMPEX, interstate policies and interstate migrants, here one does have to differentiate between the short-term circular migrants who are generally really at the bottom of the pile in terms of what I have repeatedly called, dirty, dangerous, and difficult work, in relation to the longer-term migrants who have somewhat better chances of mobility, somewhat better chances of stability in the labor market. This really reflects then on the if one had to do an index of some kind, and the index moves as it does in IMPEX and both in MyPEX and IMPEX from dimensions to policy areas to indicators, and then really puts equal weights in terms of aggregation, which is really in some sense the let's say not the pitfall, but the a problem with really all indices, that at the end aggregation issues are very important, and how you aggregate across them. Then what one finds with the impacts is that perhaps it would work if I look at the indicators that one can come up with. Perhaps these indicators and the scores would be very different between the short-term circular migrants and the longer-term migrants. The, the attention that one pays, for example, to areas like education, uh, perhaps would be of a different genre if one is looking at long-term migrants versus short-term migrants. Long-term migrants do have a problem of their children's education, middle level education, or even secondary education. But this is not a problem we usually affect short-term circular migrants. Secondly, the labor dimension, which Varun has asked me to focus on, is certainly much more important in the case of the short-term circular migrants. The levels of discrimination which they face are much higher than what, and the nature of discrimination which they face is also much higher in their case compared to longer-term circular migrants. And here also, one cannot help feeling that one would have to give a much larger weightage to labor and labor market integration in any scheme of things which compares these two groups of migrants. Uh, I think if you look at the whole issue of labor migration, one of the broad issues here is, and this is the issue with the discrimination literature in general has tried to grapple with, is that discrimination occurs in two forms, two broad forms. One is general, we measure it in terms of wage discrimination and so on, but the other is really job discrimination, and which takes the form of segmentation. Migrants and particular circular migrants of all kinds and circular migrants in particular taking a worse form of jobs. Now, this is something which is difficult to grapple with, which needs more meaningful policy interventions. Uh, but in terms of getting a quick fix on this in an index is also very difficult. But the degree of job discrimination faced by migrants, by shorter term migrants, shorter term circular migrants, is definitely much higher than the longer term migrants, and of a different order, a different nature at all. And this then ties up into wage discrimination and so on and so forth. So my argument here really would be that I think there is any exercise, and an exercise of the kind that Impex has built on, which seeks to look at policies at the state level. And here, let me point out one, I'm sorry, I'm, in a sense, having come before Priyansha, uh, circumventing a presentation because I will not be able to stay on beyond 3 o'clock. Um, uh, that if you look at how labor market discrimination acts in general, uh, and if you look at what can counteract, the affirmative action policies, which also have figured in the impacts, uh, then again you find that there is, in a sense, in some sense, a staircase, graded rights and graded access to rights, and therefore a differentiation also among different groups of migrants. Uh, in the policy sphere, there is one important aspect which I think Impacts covers, that in the all state index, it is really looking at all states. This is one lesson which I have tried to give to each state where I have interacted, that every state in India is both a state which is a destination state and a source state. So is it possible for us, therefore, to look at policies across states, not only as a destination states, which I'm so glad that Impex has tried to do, but also combine their policies as source states, and then come up also with an index of some kind. So the long and short of my observations really, and this is not a formal presentation, Varun, is to say that I think Impex has gone a long way in capturing state level policies and coming up with a broad index. I would look at a more meaningful index, which would really differentiate also between groups of migrants and between in terms of the level of vulnerability, and perhaps looking at policies which are more sort of tailor-made for shorter term migrants, circular migrants, and then policies which, like housing, for example, is a policy which affects longer term migrants in a very different and distinct way than shorter term migrants. So differentiating between the two and coming up with more nuanced policy analysis would also perhaps be very helpful for us at this stage, where actually the state has begun to respond to the issue of migration and has begun to look at issues of policies. So let me stop here, Varun.
No, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Ravi sir, and definitely we'll factor in your comments in the next iteration of Impex. I think now the initial exercise was to put it out there and get such feedback, and for sure, both the gradation point, and I think the lockdown and the crisis that we saw showed us the different kinds of vulnerabilities, different kinds of migrants face. So that gradation point is well taken, and also your point about source and destination states, which I think is definitely much more acute. That inclusion is much more required than international migration, where destination remains the most important fulcrum for integration. So both points taken very well. Thank you, sir. I know you have to leave, so thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Yeah. So now we'll have Priyansha Singh from India Migration Now. So Priyansha has been deeply involved in the creation and the evaluation of impacts. So so we heard the critique of it, we've heard the application of it, so now let's see what it is. So Priyansha, please go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So like Dr. Srivastava was saying, that he was talking about IMPEX, which is basically the Interstate Migrant Policy Index. And it's an index that's been inspired by MIPEX. We've used the MIPEX methodology and tried to contextualize it in the Indian context. Before I actually get to it, just to, some points that Dr. Srivastava had raised, for example, say something like discrimination. Anti-discrimination is a policy area that's taken into account in MIPEX, but is not featured in IMPEX. And like Sir was saying, that these such policy areas, the assessment on paper does not really exist. So while we know that discrimination for migrants exists at different levels, to actually assess something like that on paper in the Indian context is very difficult, because such provisions don't exist, which is why we had to factor in those aspects as well. IMPECS is basically an ex ante evaluation that compares all the states in India on the basis of how welcoming their policies are of interstate migrants. And like MIPEX, the index is based on two basic principles. One is the principle of equality, and second is the principle of migrant vulnerability. When we talk about the principle of equality, what we basically mean is that there are certain policy areas where if migrants have equal rights as locals, then there's enough integration. But there are certain policy areas, for example, education, where the fact that migrants suffer from their unique vulnerabilities, there's need for special interventions for them to reach that extent of integration. So this is the starting point and a basic principle that both MIPEX and IMPECS take into account. Now, the way the index basically works is there are 8 policy areas. These policy areas have been identified based on secondary literature and take into account some of the major aspects of the everyday life of interstate migrants in the country. These are labor market, education, child rights, social benefits, political inclusion, housing, domicile, and health and sanitation. What we do then is, just like MIPEX, break it down to 3 dimensions. And these dimensions, again, have been contextualized in the Indian context. What we assess at first is whether a policy exists for integration or not. Then we assess if there are measures in place to facilitate that access, to ensure that people can access that particular right or policy. And third is measures to achieve change, where we basically see what is that particular state doing in order to ensure that there is integration. So an example for that would be if the state takes into account the perspectives of all the stakeholders who are involved. Is the state maintaining records of migrants in each of these policy areas? These dimensions are then further broken down to 63 indicators that are asked in the form of questions. And each answer to the question is given a score of 0, 50, and 100. That gives you, and the average of everything basically gives you the average score of IMPECS. For 2019, the average score of IMPECS was 37, and the policy area of identity and registration had the highest score of 64. Now, what this 64 means and why it has a high score is because once interstate migrants are able to access domicile in the destination state, then they are able to access all the entitlements in place in that particular state. So the struggle there is really the access. Once that access is achieved, then your access basically becomes easier. So facilitation is basically the problem. And because of the same reason of domicile restriction, the policy area of social benefits scores the least, because most of the social entitlements in the destination states are limited to those who are locals, those who have domicile access in that particular state. Moving to the results of IMPECS 2019, Kerala had the highest score of 57. And the reason for this are 2 policy areas, education and child rights. Kerala has taken initiatives to recognize that children of migrants have unique requirements when it comes to language. They also have measures in place that take into account the workplaces where migrants work, and health and sanitation is of significance there, hence the high score. Rajasthan, on the other hand, is both the major source and destination state for interstate migrants in the country. But in the policy area of labor market, where one of the things that we assess is how easy is it for interstate migrants to, get a government job, then Rajasthan does not have these restrictions on paper. Andhra Pradesh has had its MOU with the state of Odisha, where migrants from Odisha can get access to entitlements in the destination state of Andhra Pradesh, and hence the high score. Uh, Talking about the bottom, the states that score the least in the index, Manipur has the lowest impacts score, and the reason for that is, apart from the RTE rules, the state actually does not have any provisions that give access to interstate migrants. All the other entitlements are restricted to the residents of that state. And similarly with Jharkhand, only the BOCW rules allow for a crash facility at a construction site where largely migrant workers work. But apart from that, all the entitlements are restricted to the locals. Towards the end, I just want to say that, like Dr. Srivastava was saying, it is very important to have a starting step, an index like this. But at the same time, there are a lot of measures. There are a lot of there are different kinds of migrants. They migrate for different durations. They migrate to different corridors, and all these. It's very important to contextualize an index like this. But the way we look at impacts really, and with what we saw in the last 1 year, that this can actually be that starting step. Just to look at it like a place where we actually have all the policies for destination states in one place, and we can assess how each state is doing, because even on paper, the destination states, the states that actually are major destination states, except for Kerala, have not been performing well. So this is where I want to conclude this by saying that we look at impacts as a starting conversation, and at the same time, it is very important to understand the context and how each of these policies actually pan out when we practice it, and something that Dr. Srivastav mentioned in his presentation, and Mukta is going to present in hers as well. So yeah, that's about it.
Thanks a lot, Priyansha. Thank you very much. And so, impacts, like she said, it was 2019 was the starting point, and this year, as Ravi sir hinted at the end of that, a lot of initiatives at state and central level have been taken, and to address migration as a policy priority. And so we are actively working on the next version of impacts, where we hope to take the feedback we're getting from today's discussion and other discussions we have parallelly. I encourage all our attendees and participants to look at some of the writings we have put out, some of the analysis we put out on impacts. Our paper was published on the methodology impacts earlier this year, international migration. Feel free to reach out to get access to that paper. So thank you, Priyansha, for that. Now we have Mukta Naik from the Center of Policy Research, someone whose work I've read with great interest, has influenced my thinking a lot. So I'm very happy she's here. Mukta, the stage is yours. Let me just give a quick introduction to what you're going to talk about. Mukta is going to talk about household integration. Mukta is an architect, and integration of the migrant household, the role of housing, education, child rights, and healthcare, so covering some of the other key dimensions which we cover in impacts. But Mukta has done extensive field work, extensive writings, and so I'm really curious to hear her remarks. Thank you, Mukta.
Thanks, Varun. One sec, let me just, yeah. So it's kind of weird looking at your own face when you're talking at these things. So, so I wanted to switch to gallery view. Welcome, everyone. It's my privilege to come at the tail end of a line of very impressive speakers who've done all the hard work of setting up the context and really making it really easy to break down many of the aspects of a very complex subject. I'm going to focus today on internal migration because that's my expertise area, and it's sort of follows on Priyansha's excellent presentation of the impacts. But building on both the morning's the speakers, Peter and Giacomo, but also on Dr. Srivastav's. Dr. Srivastava has already outlined that internal migrants in India have constitutional rights, and so it's sort of a distinct situation in which to look at the idea of integration. But alongside constitutional rights, there are a lot of pragmatic issues with India's federal structure with relation to governance of migration. Um, so how do you include temporary residents for the purpose of social protection programs, to give out public utilities and services? Do we make benefits portable? Do we universalize access? So, you focus on broad inclusion rather than targeted kind of practices. What's the thinking that drives migration policy? All of these questions are churning around at this moment in India today, particularly because we are in the aftermath of the COVID lockdown induced migrant crisis, where all of this has now come into the public domain and really in front and center. Things that migration scholars have been talking about, have been that people who look at labor law have been talking about, are now sort of really at the forefront. So it's a good time to think about these things, with the spotlight being on migrants. I'm going to look at destinations in my presentation today, and specifically at cities. I'm an architect and urban planner. I work on urbanization and migration, and cities really came off, I think, looking quite poorly in during the migration crisis in India. So they couldn't, for instance. Quantify how many migrants there were. They couldn't spatially locate them within cities. They didn't have ready means to reach out and had to rely on embedded actors and social and civil society networks, because they were sort of blindsided by this entire issue. And traditional channels of reaching migrant workers like employers and contractors could not be held accountable because of the high levels of informality in India. So there were certain responses that came up during this time. Some states actually moved to universalize, say, access to the public distribution system for a temporary period of time, thereby opening out a window of opportunity to think about whether it's possible to do this for a longer term. Other states looked at more targeted kind of interventions. And then there was a whole new set of responses because there were all these migrants who were returning home during that time. So the role of source states in actually improving access or helping migrants who weren't going to live there permanently but go back to destination areas also became a very interesting and further complicated, I think, the entire discussion. So while all of these lessons are enriching the conversation around migrant inclusion, we have to acknowledge that inclusion has been the main frame through which we've been looking at a migration. So integration is not a word that's natural to the policy landscape in India when it comes to migrants. We're already looking at inclusion, and in that context, I think Peter's concluding remarks about mainstreaming and inclusion and the critique of integration is something that I think we should think about more deeply, because we're already looking in India at an inclusion framework. And in fact, Dr. Srivastav has already done a detailed sort of categorization of the different kinds of exclusions that migrants face, and where in the policy framework do we need to address them. So identity-based exclusions, location-based exclusions, things like that. So that's a caveat, and we can always come back to that later. uh, uh, while we're looking at all of this inclusion policy, the question that I have always been thinking about is, does inclusive policy actually translate? So first of all, is there inclusive policy? And does inclusive policy translate to inclusive practice? So, with my background in planning and architecture, while appreciating the theoretical and the regulatory constructs of things, I think it's also important to look at whether these policies are actually translatable into action on the ground. How do ground level bureaucrats and actors, governance actors, and I'm looking at a much wider frame of governance actors, not just the government, civil society, employers, neighborhood associations. The COVID again context has really opened our eyes to the astonishing array of actors that actually influence the life of poor informal sector workers on the ground. How does the sort of action space of these actors change or get influenced by the policies? So I'm sort of thinking here in that integration, in as integration, looking at social links between migrant communities and cities. So I'm looking at the sociological sort of conception of migrant integration when I'm making the following comments, and really examining this insider outsider dynamic that migrants experience and contend with in cities, and what whether policies actually help them with social integration, whether in a shorter period of time or over a longer period of time. I'll take some sort of draw on my field work in three cities and just take some examples to illustrate what I'm trying to say. In the European context, there's already been some research to show that it's not just the policy, but the norms and the imaginaries and the interpretation of communities, destination communities, about migrants that actually influences a policy. So in that light, one can actually look back at the idea of labor market segmentation that Dr. Srivastav mentioned, or the notions around how local communities, how urban communities consider migrants or think about migrants, and then look at how those conceptions directly impact policy implementation. I'll take an example from Mangalore. It's just 15 kilometers away from the Kerala border, on the southern coast of Karnataka, where I've done some field work. The city is also a district headquarter, and while we were doing our research on migration in the city, we tried to examine the registrations under the Building and Other Construction Workers Act, and we realized that the district labor department actually has outreach programs, and they've sort of included CSOs in this to register intrastate migrants, so to register migrants from Karnataka who happen to be working in Mangalore. And it's a very organized and fairly active kind of drive to continuously make sure that these people are enrolled inside the BOCW program. And our data from our survey there of about 500 young workers found that both intra and interstate migrants in the construction sector are actually engaged in circular migration. So they're short-term migrants, regardless of whether they're migrants from within Karnataka or whether they are interstate migrants. But the local officials characterized intrastate migrant patterns as stable and interstate migrant patterns as circular. That was how they kept talking about this. And of course, the fact that Indian data on migration is poor, sort of it's impossible to refute these ideas, because seasonal and circular migration is not captured in the census and the NSS in any sort of comprehensive manner. So it's impossible to go to really show and demonstrate that seasonal patterns exist in both categories of migrants. And the conclusion we drew was that clearly it was the stronger social networks that intrastate migrants had, that they are actually able to intercede for these benefits and able to register, and the state is invested in them politically. So that's the political inclusion sort of overlays on these local interpretations and perceptions about migrants. And migrants from Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, they're just seen as North Indians. They're bracketed into one broad category of outsiders, and the city does not feel that it needs to take any responsibility for them. I'd like to point out here that part of the problem is also the lack of emphasis on portability within the act itself, and no clear guidelines to cities, states on how this is to be, circumvented. So basically, what is the mechanism if portability is to be implemented is something that's still being thought about, and there isn't a clarity on that. So even we can argue, even if there was an intention, the city may not have been able to achieve that registration. So I think there are both aspects to consider here, and I just wanted to underscore that the perception plays a role, even though there is not enough clarity on portability of these kind of systems. I think registration is an important area for us to think about right now, because the new labor codes have also emphasized migrant worker registration, and there's there's a need to sort of develop more clarity on what scale these will be done at, who will do it, how will migrant workers who are moving across different locations actually be represented in databases in various places, etc. On the vein of this perception, um, some of the interviews in Mangalore were also really interesting in terms of the perceptions about migrants that the police had. So some interviews with police officials actually reflected that they had had certain experiences when they were posted, say, in larger metros, and they have some personal biases, and so they are often reflecting those and constantly conflating petty crime with areas where migrants live. And this is a narrative that keeps on appearing. However, when we drilled down and spoke to the police personnel at the police station, the SHO, they don't report any increased crimes in parts of the city where migrants are concentrated. They're very clear that this kind of perception actually cannot find it in the data, the crime data in the city, or even the data in terms of the informal reportage that they get from communities, from beat constables, from communities across the city. So this sort of difference in perception, even within the police force, there's a difference in perception. So if and I'm saying this because in India right now, a lot of times things, a lot of stuff is interpreted as law and order issues. So, for example, during the lockdown, because there was a law and order perception of the entire situation, migrants trying to leave to find food, for instance, or to get a daily wage at a time when everything was shut down, was punitively met at that point. And because the law and order is becoming such an important part of the way we see people in our cities, the perception of the police really matters. In contrast to the police perception, city administrators, so the planning department in another city that I worked in, which is a very small city in Rajasthan called Kishangarh, it's in Ajmer district, it's a manufacturing town. They actually saw migrants as encroachers on public land. And in characterizing this way, again, this is a city where the interstate migrant population all work in marble processing factories and live on site in accommodation that's provided by employers. So they're boxed and they're away and they're invisibilized in a very particular way by spatially segregating them from the rest of the city. But when they do try to integrate, meaning when they do opt out of that employer provided accommodation and try to find other kinds of housing in the city, they are immediately seen as encroachers. And in doing so, the city authorities are actually eschewing their own responsibilities to facilitate housing and services for these populations. So this is sort of reading between the lines from long form interviews, that you realize that these are attitudes that have developed over time in order for cities which are actually very weak in terms of their resource, in terms of their capacities, in terms of their governance abilities, to be able to deal with issues like migration, for which they actually don't have either policy clarity or budgetary support, or capacities. It's actually a very complex situation, and these kind of tropes about migrants are often coping mechanisms for street level bureaucrats and local bureaucrats to deal with issues that are at a level of complexity that they cannot really address given their capacities and
Just
limitations.
a 2 minute warning, Mukta.
Yeah,
2 minute.
absolutely, absolutely. So I'd like to sort of move from there to. I'd also like to point out that in a place like Kishangarh, shared language and culture becomes a very important. So basically, short-term migrants who were coming in from the vicinity weren't even characterized as migrants; they were talked about as locals, whereas interstate migrants were the outsiders. So the context of the cultural context also becomes really important. And when we talk about integration, oftentimes we also need to examine the cultural sort of lens from which the integrating sort of place is viewing the migrant. So are we integrating from a perspective of equal opportunity, or are we integrating from the perspective of our cultural superiority, is also a sort of a thing that we need to look at even in the internal migration context as we look at something like impacts and policies across states. And lastly, I'd like to sort of look at, I don't want to paint migrants as people with no agency. I think wherever possible, and where migrants, like Dr. Srivastav said, are sort of transitioning from these short-term kind of patterns to slightly longer-term, more settled patterns of migration, they do have some space to place footholds into cities. And I'll refer to my work on informal rental housing in Gurugram, where, in urban villages, landlords are producing rental housing to rent out rooms, often congested, often substandard, to migrant workers. And the landlord is characterized as exploitative, and the migrant worker is characterized as vulnerable. But even within that, we do see that, bonds are formed over time. I find that migrants are able to resist, and talk about, voice their experiences when they feel discriminated against. And they also form bonds with, among each other, and like Peter was saying in his presentation, to intercede with the police or the local politicians in order to protect themselves, or in order to resist certain forms of discrimination. So this, I think, is something that we should look at more closely. It's not something that there is enough data on. This is a more qualitative understanding from my own field work, but I mean, it would be great to do this kind of inquiry in many other cities and see what's going on, because we do have a certain perspective about how informal rentals work. And I think, especially at this time, when I think, in the wake of the migrant crisis, rental housing has come on the policy radar for the first time in India. It's an opportunity to look at. And I use the rental housing as an example of the kind of intervention that could be integrationist in its broader thinking. But really, how are we imagining involving local communities? So right now, the intervention is very infrastructure top down in the way it looks at things. I'm going to help a bunch of private actors to go around and build these buildings in which migrant workers will get rental accommodation. But there's really no attempt to reach out to local communities who have already been involved in providing that rental housing in cities across India for a very, very long time. So there's no that conversation. And I think that's really where I'd like to stop and say that, if we are in a situation where we are seeing the government as not being able to interact with other governance actors who are already providing a host of services and solutions, however imperfect those services and solutions may be, then we are not being able to actually fully explore the potential of integration as a concept, or inclusion as a concept, for urban destinations in India. So this sort of traces back to the top level comments about how you can have integration. You can either see integration as a construct, or you can see integration as a policy, and how do you then operationalize a policy like that? I'll stop.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. And I mean, can I just say, like, just that the fact that your fieldwork has sort of identified these informal governance actors, but also no, sorry, formal governance actors, but also the informal sort of influencers, if I might say, who are contributing to the integration. That is extremely illustrative and really helps you think about how practically things happen. But if I could ask you, go at an abstract level. Let's just have an abstract conversation, because we can indulge, because this is the whole point of the masterclass. We can indulge abstractly. Is how, I mean, this your comfort level between inclusion and integration. Just let's talk about language. Where do you stand on that? I know Peter touched upon it, but I'm just curious, where do you stand on that? And so let's start with that, and I have one follow up on that. Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, the critiques of the integration process are actually pushing integration towards inclusion right now. We already have an inclusion framework. However, when we say inclusion in India, we very much see it from a policy and regulatory lens. we don't necessarily see it from a lens of the role of the wider set of governance actors. So I think, I mean, so integration or incorporation as a especially incorporation as a sociological concept is not something basically migrants are seen from a very economic sort of lens right now, because migration studies has had a very long history of being dovetailed with labor studies in the Indian context. And so the other categories, especially the categories in the MIPEX, which were focus categories like family integration, so I think we need to sort of, if we look at expanding that definition, so migrant as a social category, and sort of drill down a little bit more on what all these what does all of that include, then inclusion, it doesn't matter whether you use the word inclusion or integration, I think you're talking about the same thing. But right now inclusion is very much used more in the context of, are our policies exclusive, are they excluding somebody, and who are these vulnerable people whom we have to target for inclusion. So I think that's for me the philosophical debate. Are we saying we want to have a set of core services and core entitlements that everybody should have, which is more of a universal approach? And then, of course, there's the question of state capacity, budgets, and resources. We can't do that. And so there are these other set of things that we will have to target to those who are most vulnerable. And then how do we define that vulnerability is really the crux of the matter. And then in delivering them, what role does the government play? What is the role for non-government actors? So I'd break them down in my head in this way, regardless of what nomenclature we use.
No, that framework helps a lot, and I think that's a great takeaway for me. I can speak for myself. I mean, that kind of framework allows you to think critically about all that. In the last year, we've seen so many initiatives, so many discussions, and how do we make sense of it? I think we keep getting the inquiries that I am in from journalists and policymakers, like, how do we make sense of this? I mean, frameworks are really important, so this is really helpful. I was really keen on this notion of othering, and even Peter touched upon that. And I would love also Giacomo to jump in at some point on this one about his experience in different countries in this question notion of othering. In your experience, and I would love for you to take a bottom up approach because that's what you're taking. Is informally, what has worked in sort of minimizing this othering effect, or has anything worked in minimizing this othering effect?
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of agree with Peter there. I think it's an intergenerational phenomenon. It takes time for the othering to reduce, or to sort of, basically for linkages between different kinds of communities to develop. And in Indian cities, actually, interestingly, oftentimes different kinds of migrants are focused and sort of living together and interacting with each other. So the othering is not necessarily a host versus migrant othering. It could also be migrant communities othering each other and competing for certain kinds of footholds. So for example, even if you extend the housing example, if there's a migrant community from Bihar which is long established, then new entrants from Bihar get easy entry into the rental housing market, and other migrants have to then differentiate them in different so those kind of, so othering, I would say, is it depends on what perspective you're taking. And over a period of time, to answer your question, I think there is a role for policy, definitely, and local action in countering othering, and that needs to be thought about a little more. I'll give you an example. So there, one of the villages, field sites that I study, actually has a large number of migrants from Northeast India staying in the urban village in Gurgaon. And Northeast migrants are culturally, the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they behave are very, very different. And they're living in these very conservative patriarchal contexts. And they actually had a local association of Northeasterners, and sort of a group of Northeasterners, local villagers, mediated by the police, that came up locally to figure out some sort of broad rules with which, sort of they would go on with each other. So these are very localized mechanisms that facilitate integration with the input of the community. But the city does not go in and say, hey, this is a great way to do this. Let me replicate this in other communities across the city that may be facing the same problem. So that's where the failure occurs, the failure of policymakers to be able to identify and replicate and scale these kind of good practices.
No, absolutely. And Jacques, I mean, just to sort of take this on the international level, I mean, and we speak a lot about subnational policymakers and the role they have in, and especially in this context of the othering. I'm just curious, you've looked at global context, comparing different countries. What have you learned on that, which you can share with us?
Well, what I can say on a more general level, I must say that the ordering process is results also from the combination of a political approach, as we say, for example, on the rise of extremism or populism, also the media attitude toward migrants, and it's linked to both actually, and policies and the message that governments or policymakers give through policy. So as I showed, for example, in my presentation, more open integration policies are associated to a higher degree of acceptance of migrants in the country. So here we don't know exactly who is first, who is second exactly, but there is an association, and I think this is very important. And policies can, of course, are something concrete, but they have also a symbolic meaning, saying to the population, to the public opinion, that migrants are a part of the society. They should be, for example, supportive. Yeah. But also, I would say that also in the policy making, from policy making perspective, having, for example, targeted policies on migrants is something that personally I think it's correct. It's useful. But at the same time, it reinforces a little bit this othering process, as also Peter was saying.
Just quickly, a quick comment before we get to Rohini's presentation, which is going to really touch on this othering, given her topic. How comfortable are you with interchanging inclusion, integration? Because you deal with this all the time.
It was for me, the question?
Yes, Giacomo, yes, you.
Well, I have, but it's something that's more personal, I think, but I have a very concrete approach to this topic. So I think that we can call a little bit, we can use the term that we prefer, we want, let's say, but what is important is to clearly define the meaning of this term, because sometimes, again, as it has mentioned multiple times, with inclusion, we use integration, but we don't really know what they mean. So I think that, it doesn't really matter using inclusion or integration, but we need to define what we want to say through this term. So that would be my practical answer.
No, absolutely. No, hopefully the discussion today has given people frameworks and concepts to figure out that definition that works for them, whether you're running an NGO or you're working with policymakers or you're just volunteering on the ground. Hopefully that gives you some context. So I think this is a great segue to something which we wanted originally to happen earlier, but Rohini, thank you for waiting. She was deeply involved with adapting the work Giacomo and the good people at MPG have been doing with MyPEX to India. And so Rohini is going to talk about that. And also Rohini, is her passion, I know for a fact, is the Rohingya community in India. She's done a lot of work with them. So she's going to also reflect on MyPEX India with her work on the Rohingya community. And really, this is where the notion of othering really takes a very acute turn. Thanks, Rohini.
Right. Thanks, Varun. Just give me a minute to share. Yeah. Is everything visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I'll be talking about immigrant integration policy in India, and very specifically, I'll be talking about the results of MyPEX India 2020, which Giacomo has already kind of introduced to all of you. So our team actually conducted this assessment. We conducted a retrospective assessment for 2014 and the assessment for 2020 for MyPEX India. But I think before I go into the scores, let me give you a brief picture of immigration to the country, because as everybody has spoken about today, context is very important, and context is particularly important when we're talking about a rather Eurocentric index and when we apply it to the developing country context. So immigration is a major part of the migration relationship that India has with the world. We have a 5 million plus immigrant population. Of course, numbers are not so easy to come by in the Indian context. We have numbers from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which broadly correspond with the numbers that we also have from the census of India. So we do have 5 million plus immigrant population. We do have not a very significant number, but a high enough number of that who are refugee and asylum seekers. This data also tells us that a vast majority of India's immigrant population, I believe upwards of 90%, actually come from neighboring countries, from countries like Bangladesh and Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, etc. But interestingly, our refugee population and asylum seeking population is a little more diverse. So although we do have a large number that come from these neighboring countries, we also have refugees who come from the Middle East and who also come from the African countries. So this is a kind of broad picture of what the immigration realities look like on the ground, so that you have a sense of who are these people for whom we are implementing these policies, for whom we are formulating these policies, and what they mean for them. So I think before we go into the MIPEC scores, it's very important to underline one very important thing, which is that India doesn't have a national level immigrant integration policy. And it's important to say this because when we started this assessment, that was a major stumbling block for us, because how do you assess immigrant integration policy when there is no conception of that at the national level? So we dealt with this in two ways. The first was we looked at the general schemes that exist at the national level for the various policy areas that Giacomo has already described and that I will also be going into. And the second thing we did was we looked at, we took a regional perspective. We looked at the individual states in India, which do host immigrant or refugee populations. And we looked at whether there are state level policies. And interestingly, we did find one example. And just to quickly underscore that this is an important perspective when it comes to India because of the unique history and geography that we're talking about here. So the South Asian region historically was a contiguous region, and a lot of what we call today cross-border mobility 100 years ago was simply a population exchange in a culturally and linguistically similar area. Possibly the example that I am very closely associated with, because I come from the state of West Bengal, is of course West Bengal in Bangladesh. But we also do see it in other parts of the country. We see it with Punjab. We see it with Punjab. We also see it with Tamil Nadu in the south. And I'll be coming to these examples as I continue with the presentation. So that's an important caveat to go into this with, that the national level, outside of laws that govern entry, like the Passport Act and the passport rules, there wasn't anything at the national level that we could really assess. So now coming to our actual scores. So we are already acquainted with the 8 policy areas that MIPEX has. Giacomo's already talked about them. And I'll be talking about them in 3 sort of distinct categories. So the first is the group which we call, which Giacomo I think has already spoken about, which we will call the everyday quality of life indicators, the policy areas which have the most impact on an immigrant's everyday quality of life. And these are education, labor market mobility, anti-discrimination, and health. And in fact, India's sub-20 scores in these 4 areas contribute greatly to the low score that we have overall. We actually have a MIPEC score of 24. Here we find that, especially for the area of education and health, we find that there are national level schemes which apply to the general population, but which immigrant and refugee communities have also been able to take advantage of. And hence we see a score come out of those areas. So I will briefly cite examples for each of these policy areas, but I won't go into too many details because we'd just make it way too long then. For education, of course, we have the Right to Education Act. It's an act of parliament. It's also a fundamental right in India, which means that all children between the ages of 6 and 14 resident in India are entitled to education. Of course, the RT Act does require that the child provide a proof of age, but it also specifies that no child can be denied admission due to the lack of this proof of age. And we see, therefore, that this is a form of implicit access to immigrant communities. And in practice, in IMN's own fieldwork, we've also seen that RTE schools are utilized by immigrant and refugee communities, and the use of these are also encouraged by the UNHCR in India. A very similar situation prevails for health as well. While most national level schemes have restrictions related to nationality or related to income level or geography, which are also related to a national identification, certain things like access to primary healthcare centers or access to the integrated child development services, these are all these are also made use of by immigrant communities. And again, the UNHCR in India does encourage asylum seeking populations to take advantage of these as well. Labor market mobility is a rather interesting case. Here, we don't see obstacles as such, but access is somewhat ad hoc. So there are restrictions to employment visas based on the type of job, based on the availability of Indians to also do the same job. But we see that there are no restrictions for self-employment, and there are procedures in place for the recognition of foreign qualifications. So while there are no significant obstacles, there are also no additional measures to promote integration. And as we know, that's a major part of MyPEX as well, and hence, the score of 17. Now, coming finally to anti-discrimination, and here this is a big this is a big policy area for MyPEX, and it's a big policy area for most destination countries. Interestingly, there have been arguments that we need an anti-discrimination law internally for internal migrants as well, but given the lack of framework that we have there, we have practically nothing for the international immigrants as well. We were able to find individual clauses in particular national level schemes. For instance, the RTE has an anti-discrimination clause for children on the basis of race, religion, and belief, race, religion, and ethnicity. But outside of those, there's nothing really at the national level. And interestingly, here there is a ground reality. There is a ground reality precedent for the need for an anti-discrimination law. We have heard of instances of members of immigrant communities, notably members of immigrant communities who are asylum seekers. We've heard of this in the context of the Rohingya population, in the context of the Afghan population, also notably in the context of African students in India who have all faced discrimination in India's metro cities. So this is not a situation, this is a situation in which policy is definitely needed. Coming now to political participation, here, of course, India scores a 0 because there is no provision for political participation for any non-citizens. And therefore, that's a score of 0. Now, coming to the trifecta of family reunion, permanent residence, and access to nationality. Now, these three are very interrelated. They are very crucial components of life for semi-permanent immigrants, for long-term immigrants. And here we actually find India does a little better than in the other areas. Access to nationality, of course, is low because citizenship in India is very difficult to access. It requires 10 plus years of residence. It has specific clause associated with it according to the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2003. And although we have seen schemes like the CAA, the much contested Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, we find that the actual beneficiaries of something like CAA are so small that they don't impact a MyPEX score. They don't impact the 5 million plus immigrant population that we have. Permanent residence, interestingly, India doesn't really have a concept of permanent residence. Rather, this was actually one of the areas where it was most difficult to adapt and account for a developing country context, a country that doesn't really think along the lines of immigration. And here we find that India has the concept of a long-term visa, which has certain which has certain conditions associated with it, which is issued on the basis of certain economic clauses, etc. Hence the score of 46. Family reunion is where we see the highest score. And here, again, similarly to labor market mobility, not because there are schemes in place to help immigrants, but rather because there are no obstacles. So we don't see any obstacles for an immigrant who wants to sponsor his or her family. They do get the same, the permit that they get is of the same validity, of the same number of years as the immigrant in question. But again, nothing on top of that, nothing to help the family integrate further, and hence a score of 75. So all this adds up to a total MyPEX score of 24 for India. But of course, the score doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so an important question to ask, as a lot of the other speakers have also emphasized, is the comparative framework. So where does India stand in relation to the other MyPEX countries? So in comparison to the MyPEX 52, India is sadly right at the bottom. We rank in a category that Giacomo has described as integration denied, or where immigration takes place without integration. But as others have also argued, it may not be entirely fair to compare India to other MIPEX countries, many of which are OECD countries, developed countries, which have a history of immigration, which have a history of policy and a very different approach, really. So who can we therefore compare India to? And interestingly, this time we actually have the inclusion of other developing countries in the MIPEX index. So we do have a plausible comparison here as well. So here we really put together the countries which we felt were most comparable to India. And here we find, interestingly, India is only slightly behind countries like China and Indonesia, but significantly behind countries like Brazil and Turkey. And the question really here is why? Well, China and Indonesia actually were very similar to India 4 or 5 years ago, but some amount of changes have taken place in the last few years. Indonesia, for instance, has improved access to healthcare and certain discretionary procedures for asylum seekers. China has put into place policies of education for migrant communities, and also policies related to family reunion and naturalization. And all of this has actually resulted in an improvement of scores. Indonesia went from 24 to 26, and China went from 27 to 32 in these 6 years. India actually did not have a significant improvement in policy between 2014 and 2020. Oh, thanks, Varun. Okay. Brazil and Turkey, on the other hand, very interesting cases. Brazil, in fact, is a top 10 MIPEX country, has very inclusive policies across labor market, access to nationality, permanent residence, anti-discrimination. Brazil also has a history of being very open to refugee communities. Turkey, on the other hand, was a country which was actually right at the bottom of MIPEX 10 years ago, and now has significantly improved. And a big part of that reason is Turkey's response to the refugee crisis of the last 5 years, the policies that have evolved in response to that. So this is a kind of comparative glance of where India stands in relation to other developing countries, and it's important to keep in mind. And now, really going beyond the scores, right? Who are these policies for? What do these policies mean? What are the lived realities of immigration in India? And here, one important thing to remember is that although our numbers, perhaps in the absolute sense, are not very large, we have 5 million immigrants. I mean, in comparison to that, we have over 400 million internal migrants and about 18 million immigrants. But it is important to remember that India is the source of the world's largest number of immigrants. So we have people abroad who benefit from integration policy everywhere. And there is tremendous scope for India to lead from the front in a situation like this. What we do find as a result of the lack of a national level integration policy is segmented policies. So we have a very different approach that India takes for different immigrant communities, as well as for different refugee communities. So for instance, we have an Indo-Nepal friendship treaty, as a result of which Nepalese immigrants get a certain amount of rights and a certain amount of integration. We also historically have a very strong relationship with the Tibetan community, which actually runs a government in exile here, and Tibetan rehabilitation policy at the national level. We also have schemes at the regional level, and here is where the regional perspective becomes important, because the Tamil Nadu government has schemes for the Sri Lankan Tamil population. But we see that there are a large number of people who slip through the cracks here. We have refugees from the African countries, we have a Rohingya refugee population, we have refugees from Afghanistan, the non-minority populations in Afghanistan and Pakistan who are also counted as refugees by the UNHCR, refugees and asylum seekers, but for whom there are really no policies. So who really services these people? Well, here we have essentially ad hoc supporting initiatives from civil society. We have international organizations that have stepped in, and these are the people who witnessed a great deal of vulnerability and a great deal of otherization, if I may use the term that we were describing in the last 6-7 years. And to give, I know I don't have a whole lot of time, so to give you a quick example from my own fieldwork with the Rohingya community, many of whom have been here possibly for the last decade, many of whom have grown up here, some of them have had children here, have had their children grow up here, but continue to face these policy exclusions, continue to essentially have no security nets, no security blanket of any sort around them, and who have had to experience grave vulnerabilities during this COVID crisis, far, far worse possibly than many of the other vulnerable communities we have in the country. So a question really to ask here, and this is where we hope that MIPEX can be a starting point for these conversations, is how do we think about integration policy when immigrant communities in India are so diverse, when given the specific context of immigration into India, can we benefit from a regional approach? Can we benefit from a state level approach, a city level approach to these issues, given how micro they tend to be? Or at the national level, do they tend to get forgotten because of this micro nature of immigration into India? So I think I will stop there. These are some of the key takeaways that our team had from the MyPEC scores. Of course, there's a long way to go for India, but this is a path that will have to be traversed, partly because of India's migration relationships with the world, but also because India has very legitimate aspirations for regional leadership in South Asia. And also, our immigrant population is primarily from other countries of South Asia. So this is these are two realities that are interrelated and that will possibly clash in the coming decades. And of course, the other thing specific to the MyPEC scores that we take away from the assessment was that the elements of everyday life like health, education, and labor market may be more relevant in the short term. Rather than larger ambitions like nationality or PR. And here, possibly taking cues from other developing countries like Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia can stand India in good stead. And I think I'd like to end there.
Thank you very much, Rohini, for elaborating and also reflecting from your fieldwork. I think there's a question from Giacomo. Please, Giacomo.
Yeah, no, actually, I have to leave due to another commitment in a couple of minutes. And I wanted just to say a couple of final remarks, also based on Rohini presentation. I don't want to just to take a lot of time, but I want just to stress, and it was also asked in the chat before, the importance of course, contextualizing the results of MyPECs to the country. And I think is exactly what Rohini was doing. And it was, from my point of view, an excellent job in really understanding or making the audience understand how to apply and how to analyze and to take into account the results from MyPECs. Because of course, MyPECs applies, let's say, a standard framework, also a standard questionnaire to very different policy frameworks and in countries. So that's exactly why we rely on country experts to really contextualize both in the assessment, but also when we provide the audience with the results itself, or the context and the policies, the integration policies in the country. So thank you again for inviting me, and yeah, all the best. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Giacomo, and thank you for your time. I'm also just wrapping up. I just want to conclude with a couple of remarks. One, I think the discussion today for me was really important because I know, like, when we were conceptualizing IMN, these discussions around integration and it's what it means and why it's important, and what if we're successful integrating, what does it mean? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? There were all kinds of questions which came up, but which guided strategically our choices at IMN, what we have done, and also where impacts and our participation with NPG came from. So I'm glad we could finally elaborate upon some of some of these positions, but also the complexities of what we're dealing with here. Because it's one thing for us to develop frameworks and indices, and has been elaborated by various speakers. How does it actually help people in the end? I mean, that's what we're here for, ultimately, hopefully. And so I think when we start thinking in those terms, and and now we have interventions in place that I spoke about the two around financial services, but also what we're doing with immigrants from India who go abroad. We didn't get into that, but a lot of the MyPEC stuff applies to also Indian workers when they go to different destinations. We have the world's largest immigrant sending country in the world. What's happening to them when they go there? Are we learning enough about that? Right? There was a question when Ravi sir speaks about the role of source states. What is India doing for its immigrants? This question also comes up. So I think this notion of integration applies to migration into from within India, which is the basis of our work. And I really encourage everyone to reach out to us. This is just the beginning of what we believe is the launch pad for migrant studies in India, like the way we see it. And we're trying to bring in all the people we know around the world. And we encourage all of you to do the same and participate. And we'll have a lot of discussions, but also a lot of advocacy work, a lot of actual interventions. So this is not just chat. This is actually, we do plan to, where we can take action. So thank you very much to all our speakers. Thank you so much Thank you to my team for organizing this and doing this. Thank you so much. And to you, listeners, and everybody tuning in on different platforms. Have a good day, and till next time. Bye-bye.